Greetings, everyone. I'm Johanna, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at SAMA. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'm super excited to moderate this panel, and I hope you all are ready to think and rethink the words we use when discussing Latin American art. As always, please drop any questions you may have during the program in the Q&A chat, and we will get to those at the end of the conversation around 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. And as a reminder, this program is slated to finish at 7:30. So in this inaugural SAMA Salon, we have a panel of SAMA curators and outside scholars who will discuss the current state and future of Latin American art nomenclature. So before we get into that, let's do some introductions. So first off, we have Ruben Cordova. Ruben is an independent art historian and curator with a PhD from UC Berkeley. Ruben has taught at a variety of colleges and universities, including UC Berkeley, Sarah Lawrence College, and the University of Houston. He has curated more than 30 exhibitions and has written or contributed to over 15 catalogs and books. Ruben's writings include Gonzafo, the Chicano Art Group, and the Politics of South Texas, which explores the historical significance of the activist art group. And it won an honorable mention at the 12th Annual International Latino Book Awards. Next, we have Ella Diaz. She's an associate professor of English and Latino Studies at Cornell University. Her book, Flying Under the Radar with the Royal Chicano Air Force, Mapping a Chicano Art History, explains the art, poetry, performance, and political activism of a vanguard Chicana art collective founded in Sacramento, California during the US Civil Rights era. For this work, she won the 2019 Book Award for the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies Association. Her second book, published in 2020, is a primer on Chicano artist Jose Montoya and volume 12 of the UCLA and Chicano Studies Research Center's AVER series. Next, we have Lucía Abramovich-Sánchez. She joined the San Antonio Museum of Art in 2019 as the Associate Curator of Latin American Art. From 2013 to 2016, she held the position of Curatorial Fellow for Spanish Colonial Art at the New Orleans Museum of Art. She has also previously served as a curatorial research assistant at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., where she worked in the museum's Office for Latin America. She received her PhD in the Joint Latin American Studies and Art History doctoral program at Tulane University. She recently reinstalled SAMA's Latin America Folk Art Gallery, renamed as the Latin American Popular Art Gallery, and is the co-curator of SAMA's special exhibition currently on view, titled No Ocean Between Us, Art of Asian Diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean from 1945 to the present. And then last but not least, Bernadette Capp. She's an anthropological archaeologist with a focus on cultures of Mesoamerica, specializing in the Maya. Her research has focused on the economy of the classic Maya, ranging from 300 to 900 AD, in what is now Belize. This includes material studies of objects made for and exchanged through marketplaces. She also has conducted research on the royal lineage at the site of Buena Vista del Gallo and the use of art and architecture to legitimate royal authority. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's currently the SAMA Andrew Mellon Post-Doctoral Curatorial Fellow, focusing on the art of the Americas before 1521. And those are our wonderful, brilliant panelists. And so to ground our conversation, we thought that we really can sink into what the Latin American art nomenclature is currently. And so nomenclature is just, a fancy word for classification or classifying things together based on shared qualities or attributes. So as you can see from here, there's so many words to describe art from this region. And like many of these art historical terms, these designations are historically rooted in colonialism. And so our guiding question for tonight is, how can we rethink the way we talk and write about art history to provide a more thoughtful approach towards Latin American objects? So the first question of the night is just to think about, how do we get here? How have your areas of study treated terms in the past? For example, the development of folk, or even the switch from primitive to pre-Columbian. How has this evolved over time? Feel free to jump in.
I can kick it off just because you mentioned folk. This is something that I've been thinking about obviously a lot since arriving at the museum, because my first task was to reinstall the SAMA Latin American folk art collection. And in researching just kind of more contemporary scholarship on the topic, I noticed that scholars were using different terms to refer to the genre and sort of moving away from folk. And that led me to look into when this art form kind of arrived in the United States or started being talked about in English and its different iterations. So actually, if you could pull up the slides, those are probably useful for this particular. So just really briefly, arte popular, or what was formerly referred to as folk art, kind of came into being as an art form, like a formal genre after the Mexican Revolution, so around 1920. So part of that movement that was sanctioned by the government included an exhibition, this exhibition of popular art that was exhibited in 1921 in Mexico City. It was organized by Dr. Adel, who was a Mexican scholar, writer, curator, Roberto Montenegro, and Jorge Enciso. And Dr. Adel did a 2-volume or a catalog for the exhibition, all in Spanish, obviously. But this sort of was the entry point into it being a major genre. And if you skip ahead 10 years, in 1930, the museum director, curator, dealer, René de Harnoncourt did an exhibition that was organized with the American Federation for the Arts, but started at the Met and moved throughout the United States, called Mexican Arts. There was another exhibition on that had Mexican folk art in the United States in 1922, but this is sort of the big one that circulated around the country. And in this exhibition, actually, he refers to folk art also as applied arts. So there's like this shift back and forth from arte popular to applied arts. And then if you move ahead 10 more years to 1940, the blockbuster exhibition, 20 Centuries of Mexican Art, that took over the entire building of the Museum of Modern Art that year, 1940. That showed the definitive shift into what is folk art, referred to as Latin American folk art. And without going into it too much, for me, this seemed to be born out of the popularity of folk as it's referring to European or American folk art forms and applying that standard to Latin America. But starting with the scholarship of like James Olds, and then I'm trying to think of other people off the top of my head, and I'm having trouble, like Carol Damian, I guess in 2006, and like other scholars that are writing about this genre started referring to it as popular art. And I sort of like that better because it harkens directly to the movement as it was in Latin America. But I understand that like this is all sort of just like a scholarly journey looking at the history, but you know, that doesn't mean that the term folk should be like, we're throwing it away. It's just a reimagining, you know, thinking about the term more deeply. And with that, I'll stop my monologue about folk art for the time being.
That was excellent. Have you ever seen applied arts used elsewhere?
Not off the top of my head. I've seen traditional arts used as a term mostly to describe because it's also, folk art is also conflated with indigenous art.
Yeah.
So it's like all of these terms, and this is what interests me so much about terminology, is that we just sort of like piece together these terms, and sometimes we lose the source, the point of why we refer to things in that manner. I see it also with colonial Latin American art, but yeah, I'll cede the floor.
I've seen applied used at art schools too, like applied arts, like where the training actually happens. I also think about the changing of art school names. So something like the California College of the Arts and Crafts to the California College of the Arts, right? And so why is crafts removed from the name in the early 2000s? And these art categories are constantly shifting, but I would argue that one thing stays the same, and that speaks to the valuation of these categories, how they're valued. So Lucía, brilliant context for thinking about, if we were to go back to the blue slide, which we don't have to, but this idea of a Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx art, just really quick if you wanted to, but then I like what Lucía did, because when I see that show, art, and then 1940 in New York City, and then I see sort of the emergence or the articulation of arte popular, my mind thinks 1940s Bracero program, the first movements of working class peoples, not just working in the fields, but also the railroad construction. You have working class people moving around this time. And then in the 60s and 70s, you see second generation Mexican Americans that are going to school either on their own GI Bills or on the establishment of their parents that are their fathers or whatnot that served before. And you're seeing the advent or the emergence of concepts like the Concilio de Arte Popular, like in California, for example, the Council of Popular Arts, as a way of making space in terms of government, but also just in terms of funding and whatnot for what is becoming Chicana art. So not necessarily representing the same, as Lucía pointed out, it can be used synonymously sometimes with indigenous art, but not being necessarily representative of the same mediums, the same forms, or the same people, if we were to expand these categories, but certainly a reiteration of those terms. And I would say sort of at the interstice or the intersection of what is American notions of populism and what are Mexican notions of populism, right?
Mm-hmm. Bernadette, do you have any kind of thinking about this indigenous word and then primitive, and then, how does that work in your field?
Sure. So could you go back to the slide with all of the terms? Yeah. So art in Mesoamerica, it's hard to say what word we're going to use right now. I typically use Mesoamerica, and that's very common amongst archaeologists. So I'll probably slip into that term. But thinking about the history again, similar to what Lucía presented, art from ancient times in the Americas didn't come into museums until much later. 1930s being early periods. Collecting really took place in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and kind of a drop off in the 90s. So at the very beginning, we have just a few items coming into museums, and they didn't know how to classify them or where to put them. There were also the other culture, the non-Western culture. So often art from Mesoamerica and South America got lumped in with African and Oceanic art. Mm-hmm. Thank goodness that has changed and no longer being, I hope no longer being used in museums. And so along came terms like Pre-Columbian. And Joanne Pillsbury attributes that to it developing out of the World's Fair, the Columbian World's Fair, and having to, again, lump groups of people together. And it just kind of took off from there. In the 30s, it was used a little bit, but then again, a big jump in the 50s on. And I think it's also very similar to what Ella said in terms of the GI Bill and getting education. As we learn more about Mesoamerica, ancient Americas, more knowledge is gained, and we can become more specific. But these years, pre-Columbian, it really forefronts the European perspective. And that's not what we want to do. We want to recognize the indigenous cultures of the Americas. So we use terms like Mesoamerica, which is also a term that kind of lumps things together, and archaeologists will debate on where you draw the borders and how you make the connections between the cultures within that geographic zone. We also talk about ancient Americas, but Lucía has been talking about this a lot. Who gets to define what ancient is? What was going on in Europe at the time of the Maya, of the Aztec, who were very complex societies. So art of the Americas is kind of a general term. I had in my bio the art of the Americas before 1521 to mark that time period, that switch and that change. And Lucía and I have talked about this quite a bit, not to give reference to anyone or any person, but to just mark that as a change. Something that I came across just recently, if you can go, I think, Johanna, it's the last slide.
we're gonna fast forward through a lot of images, y'all, so just bear with us here.
Yeah, so well, the slide before, just kind of a quick view doing a Google search, you can see that the term pre-Columbian art is falling out of favor on Google and on the internet. And there are reasons, you could say, because it's falling out of popularity. It's not no longer the kosher term to use, but it could also be related to what's going on the internet as well. But if you go to the next slide, Johanna. Something I just recently came across was the National Museum of Mexican Art, where there's a pushback for this term of pre-Columbian and a flip to pre-Cuauhtémoc. And Cuauhtémoc was the last Aztec ruler among the Aztec. So kind of a flip. But Ella, I don't know if you want to talk about what we just mentioned.
I definitely do, but I also, I'm not going to pronounce my Nahuatl terms correctly. My apologies to you all, and definitely with respect, but my pronunciations will be 100% Pocha. So what I was saying earlier about the pre-Cuauhtémoc is, it's fascinating to me. I don't mean this as a direct hit or deep criticism, but it's interesting how we move from one sort of imperial or sort of national master narrative of a nation to another. Like when we periodize things in the United States, for example, and right now I'm drawing on work by Emma Perez, the decolonial imaginary, and certainly Jose Saldivar, the reimagining or remapping American culture studies. So these are ideas that have been in discourse for some time. But when I say something in the United States like Abraham Lincoln, that figure becomes a trope, if you will, a mark on a map in space and time. When I say Abraham Lincoln, what do you think? You think US South, you think 19th century, you think the Civil War. So we have all these ways in which we can create abbreviations of nation. And while I appreciate Mexico and respect every nation's right to create its own master narrative, this sort of participates in that. I don't know how much this works outside of a romanticist notion of a La Raza Cósmica, a romantic indigenous past, if you will. And certainly you all know better than I that there's a lot of scholarship and historical work done on the problem of situating, the Aztec Empire, if you will, as being this sort of not being sort of an imperial force that created its own sort of structure of, sublimation, if you will, of other indigenous groups. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about that across multiple fields. So That's sort of what I was thinking of when I was saying this is, you know, sort of a reiteration of a master narrative of a nation. So power stays in place, if you will, when we use terms like this.
Right, and we still are in the quagmire of what do we call art of the Americas pre-1521.
I'm also curious, like, how does the term catch on to popularity, right? Like, how do we start enforcing or upholding these new terms? But by changing terminology, you know, what is happening? Yeah, what is this conversation? Like, who are we serving when we think about changing these terms?
Well, I think there's a change to geographic terms. If we look at primitive, well, the implication is that somehow they're pre-civilized, or they're, you know, before something that we are. And even though a lot of the works that they called primitive were actually late 19th or early 20th century works, that they were coeval with, you know, modern art. And Robert Goldwater, who was the first director of the Museum of Primitive Art, Rockefeller's museum that was founded in 1957, he had a quip, and he said, what's primitive art? The stuff that's not in the Met. And the ironic thing is that they had some really great, what we call pre-Columbian or whatever art in the 1800s. And even in 1900, they made a very major purchase, but then they farmed it all out to Brooklyn or to natural history because they didn't really see it as part of, you know, the civilized story of art. And, you know, part of it was, you know, moral teaching. And, you know, when it was founded, they had these ideas of applied art, that it would serve as a model for artists and for artisans and good design. And there was a moral character because it was based on the Victoria and Albert Museum and the ideals they had. So the primitive stuff didn't belong there. It wasn't civilized. It was somehow uncivilized. And then it was also romanticized by especially early 20th century artists because they thought that the European tradition was completely bankrupt, that the whole tradition of academic art that went back to the Renaissance and rediscovering classical forms, that it was enervated, it was played out, and it was almost a parody of itself. And they wanted to find something new and something vital. And I think Picasso especially romanticized, you know, what he saw as African art. And then finally, I guess in the 1930s, there was maybe some renewed interest, and, you know, the Museum of Modern Art played a big part in showing some of these early exhibits before the Met did. And Rockefeller actually offered to fund excavations in Mexico in 1939, and he approached the director of the Met, who was an Egyptologist, and he declined it. I guess he thought they weren't worth digging up. So he went on to found his own museum, the Museum of Primitive Art, and then in '69 he offered it to the Met along with the rest of his private collection of, quote, primitive material. And I think that was really a big revelation to a lot of museums, the quality of the material, and also the exhibition Primitivism in Modern Art held at the Modern, that really, tried to get the greatest pieces it could get from all over the world. And it was pretty spectacular. So I think there's kind of a sea change there when you went to MoMA and you saw the greatest pieces from all over the world and then compared it to the modern works, and the modern works weren't as good, really. And so I think that was the sea change when everybody thought, wow, this stuff is really great. And, I like my modern art, but it doesn't really compare with a lot of this stuff. And now we have a change to more geographic designations. So when the Primitive Art Museum was absorbed by the museum, it was referred to as the Primitive Wing or the Rockefeller Primitive Wing. And It was even the Department of Primitive Art formally. And then it got changed to the Arts of the Americas, Oceania, and Africa. There's maybe a parallel with, what had been called the Islamic wing, and now it's the art of Arab lands. And I don't, there's like 20 words in there. I can't even remember it. So it's a move to geography from description. And I think the rationale there is that we're not looking at Islamic art all over the world. We're only looking at it in, certain parts of the world. We're not looking at it in South Africa or somewhere else, but only these designated geographic locations. And
Right.
I think the other shift is that what had been the American wing at the Metropolitan had only been the United States. And now they started, there's a collection, the Diker collection, major Native American collection that was given there. And they wanted it put in the so-called American wing. So it's there in the American wing. And then just in the last few years, they started collecting colonial Latin American. Now, they'd already had some in the 1800s, but they never built on it. And now they're actively collecting it and putting it in the American wing. So it's not just the US American wing anymore.
I agree, but I have to interject that there's certain words that nomenclature that doesn't change though. While all these other categories change over time and become regionally specific, and the nomenclature that doesn't change is the contemporary and the modern in terms of museum representation. And that's where it's a fascinating journey for what are considered to be the identity arts, which they're not identity arts. You could also argue that Chicanx, Latino Latinx arts are extensions. Diasporic extensions, fragmented extensions. They call it postmodern. There's all these other words we put on it, but are really
extensions of what?
Extensions of the Pre-Columbian, extensions of the Mesoamerican that you can find through all of them. I put in the chat a show that happened at the Whitney that my colleague, Colonial Latin Americanist Nanda Kona Ponte, reviewed in Hyperallergic, and looking essentially at contemporary, what are called Latinx artists or Latinx art for the indigenous space, modern architecture and new art. And this is always sort of positioned as being, contemporary, body and environment, body art. We can go down the road, but the reality is that the center of contemporary and modern very rarely do those shift, whereas the rest of the representation will shift. The Museum of Man, for example, when you enter into these spaces, these are anthropology museums. What are you going to be looking at there that is, say, different than an Art of the Americas wing? I think the only things that will be significantly different will be the didactic, perhaps the placards, but the objects might be the same.
Right.
Displays might be different too. I mean, I think display definitely plays into all of this as well, and thinking about like shifting galleries and I think those two factors definitely will go hand in hand. Sorry, Johanna, go ahead.
No, go for it. This is good. We're on the right track here, because I was thinking like the differentiations of natural history museums and how they still have objects that are then in art museums, and we think of them completely different in those contexts, right? Like it's a artifact over here versus, a fine art thing, right? And I think that's the Western colonialism binary that we have, like, that we've kept, I suppose, right? We always have this, you're either or, it can't be both or whatever, but Bernadette, please speak more to this if you want.
I think with the art museum versus natural history or art of man, it's the masterpiece versus an object of material culture, that there's some compelling reason that it's in a great museum, and the other one is just a sample of something, and it might be average or even indifferent. And I think that's
back on that and say that there's also ideological indexes for these things, that behind these choices they can also be deeply ideological. My point was that what happens when you find the same object, not, but the same, the ceramic in, the olla, the burial pot in the Museum of Man, and then you have it also on display in the Art of the Americas. But Bernadette probably has more to say about this as sort of an expert in this particular,
Well, yeah, I mean, it's this play between anthropology and art history. And I think Lucia is right that the didactics are really going to be different in or maybe you said that, and the display of it, the putting Native North American cultures is mostly what you see in a natural history museum. And it's a way of othering them and saying that they're not part of this high culture, this fine culture.
Well, you'll get almost no didactics, though, in most natural history museums. You're lucky if you get a label telling you what it is, or even telling you whether it's original or a copy. If you go to the Natural History Museum, they'll have a big Olmec head copy, and all these people will be taking pictures of it because they think it's original, or they'll have huge stelae and their copies too. And people are taking pictures mostly with the copies, not aware that they're copies because it's not clearly stated this is a copy. So you kind of lack didactics in at least the old-fashioned Natural History Museum of Man exhibits, such that you have no idea what you're looking at.
Let's talk that more about like how are people responding to different objects in different contexts with different terminologies in terms of, artists or, Latin American communities. Like, how do you figure that into language?
Well, you set me up perfectly for my slides. So what I tried to put together, this is brilliant for where I sort of wanted to contribute to the conversation is this makes me think, we are in a critical shift right now of nomenclature. We do have intergenerational audiences looking at the art for different reasons. There are folks that want to do better work around museum outreach. There are people accessing museums for to create different relationships with the work. Not to suggest that that hasn't happened before. When Ruben was talking, I kept thinking about Artifact piece by James Luna at the Museum of Man in San Diego in the 80s, where he enters into a case, right, and is surrounded by placards that say, a scar on ring finger is, from failed dreams, and all this silly stuff all around his body. And he was making the point about Lisueño indigenous representation and that relationship to those places, as Bernadette was saying, that create peoples of the past. So certainly if you're an indigenous American going into some of these museums, it can be a strange experience to see burial ollas or different things. But then what do we do also when we see something like the Chicano Codices show in the 1990s? That's the 500th anniversary. So this is one of the first, in terms of this side of the Americas, one of the first disruptions, if you will, or interventions on those 500th anniversary quincentennial celebrations, right? And so you have the Mexican Museum in San Francisco, and they have this show. So we're looking at a stele with a very famous piece with on the cover with the graffiti on it by I think this is Chaz Bojaquez. And then if you switch my slide, and then I wanted to put some of the pieces that I find great humor in. This is quite beautiful, but let's really look at the construction of this scroll. What is the artist using here to create this piece? And it actually resonates with what Lucia was talking about earlier with the popular arts. So the Chicanos, now this is the 90s, so this is about 30 years into Chicano art, but they also are, as well as Latinx arts nowadays, and a lot of arts made across the world that we now call postmodern and are highly collectible in modern art spaces, but they're using everyday materials to construct these objects. Now, is this not in sort of that higher collection, if you will, of beauty and masterful execution? This is why I was saying, like, a lot of these choices made by the collectors and the curators are deeply ideological. You can switch to the next slide. Now, this is one of my favorite pieces in the collection of an artist that puts together, and I have it here, the Codex Muñoz, and it says it reifies Petrocoatl, a fictitious prophetic Aztec deity discovered by the artist during a recent Templo Mayor excavation, who will save us and the planet from our dependence on petroleum. This is by far my favorite of the collection. There's a Barbara Carrasco piece to the side, but this is what Chicano artists, Chicanx artists now, to be more inclusive, but in their generational moment, this is what they're constructing as codices, as artifact piece. So if we think about folk art and collectability, and I'm thinking about Bernadette's work around the objects and, you know, copies of the copies, simulacra, you know, this is one of the thematics, if you will, of Chicano art, right? What is the real thing? And also there's a performativity here, right, to how it's constructed. And I think that's it for the Chicano Codices show, but I just wanted to bring that show up because it's on the 500th anniversary of the pre-Columbian, or the arrival of Columbus. And then where are we right now in the anniversary cycle? It's, you know, 2021, and what's this the 500th anniversary of? So it's a real interesting time to think about nomenclature and representation and how we want to reframe the objects and the stories that they're telling about the Americas. Yeah, so that's sort of what Chicano art was doing around these objects, these makers, these people having different relationships to representations. You know, that book that Lucía showed and Bernadette with the Olmec head, you know, a lot of these artists coming up in public school in the United States, not necessarily having the access to sort of the master narratives of Mexican art, are getting bits and pieces and fragments and putting it back together. And I think that that's the work of what Carrasco is doing with her version of a codex, right? Telling a particular narrative, a family story, but you see the Looney Tunes or the Flintstones in there, which is another really sort of sardonic play, right, on primitive and before. And so you see a lot of that in the Chicana art historical canon, as you are also seeing in the Latinx canon. If you check out that link to that show that my colleague reviewed, there's a lot of play there around Native indigenous arts and the Latinx experience.
I'm just thinking, like, thank you so much, Ella, for this amazing group of slides. I'm like so into this catalog. I've been scouring Abe books all week to find a copy. It's so good. It's making me think about sort of the question about, like, what's the point of this? Who are we serving? And from the perspective of, like, historical Latin American collections, quote unquote, like older stuff, or, you know, whatever's not considered modern contemporary, my belief is that by thinking about these terminologies and providing a more thoughtful approach, or just like a more welcoming language, it opens up spaces so that art like this mask, or like the codices in the 1992 catalog, or the ones that are being produced now by Chicanx and Latinx artists, can find spaces within historical collections to, like, have healthy reference points, or even be displayed alongside them. Even though some of these archaic terminologies have inspired people to, you know, or artists to make responses, and that's, you know, is constructive, I think we can make these galleries just more up to the times, like whatever that might be for, I mean, I think that's the whole point of this conversation, right? Just like think about how we can get there. But when I look at this, I'm like thinking, how could I display this in, or would it make sense? Would it be appropriate to display it in a gallery that's not the modern and contemporary gallery? You know, is the point for it to be in what is the typical modern contemporary gallery, very stark, very open, you know, with a very abstract label, with abstract language? Or can we think about ways in which we can display it alongside historical material, and have like a deeper conversation about the influences, and where we go from there after that dialogue is initiated?
Well, why couldn't you show it in a pre-Columbian gallery? If you show Chagoya, why couldn't you show this? What's the
I want
difference?
that. I know. I was thinking about Enrique Chagoya when you said, yeah. I mean, that's a wonderful example. I think you can probably speak more about that, Ruben, than me, but it's, you know, about Chagoya's work and how it references pre-Columbian art.
So it seems like there's a question to me of temporalities and geographies, right? So Ruben was pinching that we were kind of moving towards like a geographical based terminology, but then it seems like museums, art history, were a very linear timeline kind of space. And what you're asking, it seems like, yeah, why couldn't you be a contemporary artist in a historical, older space? And what does that mean? Because I feel like, is that offensive to the artist to be like, can I not be considered contemporary art? Or is it always going to be displayed in this kind of in the past? Or is that a form of erasure, do you think? Or how does language affect that, plus space in a museum specifically? Contextually, I know it's kind of off the books here, but
Well, I was just thinking that, you know, when LACMA still had buildings and exhibits, in the pre-Columbian wing, they had a huge Chagoya with Superman flying in. And I think they bought it specifically to put it there in the pre-Columbian gallery. And it looked great. So I think some museums are mixing and matching, breaking up the categories a little bit.
To tell new stories, because it's an ideological turn. And to sort of riff off what you both are saying, like if you hit the next slide, you know, in terms of temporalities, in terms of, because my argument, to be clear, is certain categories don't seem to ever change. And that would be modernity and the contemporary. And so what do we do? You know, another great example I've written about Sandy's work, Sandy Rodriguez, this is one of her maps from the Codex Rodriguez y Mondragon that she's starting. It's a new Chicana Codex, although other scholars who are writing about who are Latin Americanists and colonial Latin Americanists and medievalists, she brings everything into a room in her work. They call her other things. I choose to call her a Chicana artist because to me, this is Chicana art. So here she is working on a series of maps on a mate paper. She uses the Florentine Codex literally as a recipe book to learn how to make the various organic colorants using the plants native to this area in this hemisphere. But here's the Chicana part. She always laughs at me when I say this. She began her field work going out into the Southwest and then the Pacific Northwest, taking classes with a an herbalist that I believe is, I think his name is Tenur Fanur. I think he's Norwegian. So it doesn't get more Chicana than that, right? She's Mexican-American. She's from Baja California, and her, you know, comes from a family of Mexican and Mexican-American painters. And then she learns how to make all of these indigenous colorants from a European, you know, out in the desert. It doesn't get more Chicana than that. And so it's a tradition of having knowledge and knowledge removed from you, and then having it come back to you in fragmentation. And if you flip the slide, how do you display objects? Well, this is a contemporary on a contemporary. So here you see a really cool installation of her work in which her maps are actually documenting in real time, say the 21st century's prognosticos, or the 21st century's revelations. So she creates a map of, you know, for those killed in Los Angeles in 2018. And then the museum chooses to juxtapose this work with something that they had in their collection. So thinking about materiality, right? This artist's work on the uniforms of police officers installed in a particular way next to Sandy's map and the materiality of the mappa and the mate paper, but made a map of the 21st century using, for lack of a better term, like a pre-Columbian technology for telling time, right? So that's that sort of total disruption of spatiotemporality that's possible in this Latinx, Chicanx way of doing things that I wouldn't just call modern or contemporary.
Yes, and you're talking about mixing things all around. I think we're also kind of butting against this, just a step back to kind of think of what the way that we change names and why do we change names and who does it serve. And Ruben and Ella talking about mixing things together, modern art with pre-Columbian art. I think we're kind of also butting up against this kind of staid institution of the arts that is, for at least pre-Columbian times or Native North American times, would kind of say the culture is static. It's not going to change. It's not changing anymore. It's not interacting with us. Versus this new change in, mixing things, it redefines what a museum is, and that art is, and art from the past is, it's alive, it's dynamic. I think, Ella, a lot of your examples are really demonstrating that. Is how do we move forward with that in a museum setting?
And it's fascinating to me, Bernadette, that young people, in particular students, right now in this moment, are moving past the 60s and 70s and reaching directly back to Mesoamerican art. I see that more and more, sort of skipping this integral moment for scholars like me and wanting to take the direct path back. But then all I have to do is remember when I was coming into consciousness, of a Chicano art history, that's what I was doing as well. So what is this constant sort of, I don't want to universalize it, but what is this sort of when you're coming into consciousness about a particular history that you're reaching back to these earlier times and then working your way back, So I think a lot about that. And to circle back to Ruben's work on the Hispanic Society in New York, I found it, you just recently published that piece on the new curator, the new head director. And what I found really compelling about your writing about Kynes' work is how, you asked him, why did you leave the Louvre or, and then go to the Kimball and now you're here. And he said, well, I've always admired in the American museums, the community building initiatives, the museum outreach, that seems to be something particular to the American museum. And he meant the United States, right? Like he's thinking about sort of visual democracies, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Don't really have that at the Louvre.
So there, it speaks again to that sort of ideological turn that informs the curator and his choices.
I don't know if maybe this relates, but I'm even thinking about like your title, Lucía, as in like you're the curator of Latin American art, but your specialty is not like your modern contemporary plus your pre-Columbianist plus your Spanish colonial. Like, how does that even, like, we just keep reinforcing, I feel like, a collapsing of space or people or cultures. Yeah.
That's a unique problem to SAMA because because of the way the collection is organized, it all falls under one curatorial position. I'm very grateful to have Bernadette as a colleague to like aid in the interpretation. But yeah, I mean, I think that the position titles, I mean, this also happens in academia, are just as they're definitely part of the problem, and they're very limiting. And it makes me think, just this whole conversation has also made me think about how in our current times, the notion of Latinidad firstly, the notion of Latinidad is exploding. I think especially for younger, like Gen Z folks who are have like, parents or maybe first generation Latin American, they're not identifying necessarily specific, like with the idea of Latinidad as it's generally looked at in the United States, which is definitely a narrative of like the Cuban community in Florida, the Boricua community and Dominican communities in the New York area, the Mexican American communities in Texas, the Southwest, California, Chicago. It's much broader, and also it's problematic in that it excludes a lot of other Latin Americans in that generalization. I mean, folks of African descent, like Black Latinos, Afro Latinos, Asian Latinos. I mean, that's what the entire exhibition currently at SAMA is about bringing visibility to that community. So yeah, I mean, that definitely is, the thing is with Latin American art as like the overarching term, what do we do with that? And you mentioned about how to popularize these terms. That was like a question. And I think that that's where we can really get into the weeds, because I'm never gonna, tell someone that they shouldn't identify as a certain way. If you want to say you're Hispanic or you want to say you're Spanish and you're not, I mean, because sometimes that's how people refer to themselves as their identity as Latin Americans or Latinx or Latino people. So, that's where there's sometimes can be a disconnect in really getting into the weeds with these terms. So my challenge, I think, is how to respond to the disintegration or dismantling or explosion of Latinidad through my context, which is through the museum context. How does display and how does language and really like the didactics, right? Like the wall text, the titles of the works, how can those rise to the occasion that we're living in right now?
Could you speak a little bit more about how wall labels, right? If we have contemporary artists or anyone really, how do labels currently reinforce things, what are some of the ways that you're thinking of trying to dismantle or bring more depth and breadth to all of Latin America and what that entails?
I have a really big one, and it's actually a question for me that I would love to introduce to my fellow panelists and to the audience, which is the designations for modern and contemporary art, which is not my area, but I do collaborate with our modern contemporary curators just because of the way that the Latin American Art Center is organized. When you say someone, like typically when you're looking at a Latin American artist, you say like the artist and then the country of birth of the ethnicity, or like the nationality rather, sorry. But that's can get very complicated for a lot of artists, and it really pigeonholes artists into identities that aren't necessarily theirs, or just cuts away so many nuanced things about their identity. Like I'm thinking about Carlos Merida, who's a Guatemalan born artist, but who worked in Mexico. So do you say Mexican? Do you say Guatemalteco? What do you write? And why do we even have to have these like birth, like nationality designations in this context? I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, that's that through line, right? Like in the beginning, we were kind of talking about nation building and nationalism, and museums are kind of a way to, it's a mechanism to nationalize, right? To like, what am I thinking?
Well, just to categorize to begin with.
Yeah.
But you can address the bigger question in the text, right? Say what he did and where he was when he made that work, or what experience was formative for that, be it in Guatemala or Mexico, right? You're not limited to that one line, fortunately.
And speaking of Guatemala, in the 2010s, I was able to see a state-sponsored show, and I had just concluded teaching a Latino literature course, and I spent a lot of time teaching Central American literature, because as we know, in the history of the United States, we have a second generation now of young Salvadoran Americans and Guatemalan Americans that are part of the diaspora, the refugee crisis coming out of the civil wars. And so when I was walking around the show in one of the government buildings and looking at the work of contemporary Guatemalan artists, I was noting, as Lucía said, that it definitely tells you where everyone's from, but it also was telling me where everyone lives. And the majority of the artists were not living in Guatemala. And as the viewer, I was recognizing, oh, there's a huge expat diaspora of people that had to leave because of the content of their work. And so there are other histories that are bound up in this didactic. Not everyone would know that, But then I started to think that I wonder how the people of Guatemala City experience this when they see that. You know, and so it's another layer to this, that when we think of art history and we think of art representation in the museum as a space, these are also intimately bound up in the processes and of you know, conquest and colonization, and of modern war and nation making, and the art tells these stories. And so it's very serious work to think about nomenclature, and to think about what we call the art, and the diversity of viewership, and how that's going to impact them. This isn't identity politics. This is the very essence of the story of us.
Yes. Sorry, I thought Lucy was going to say something, but
I actually, yeah, I had something. I was just made me think about. Ruben shared with us a link about Hispanic versus Latino, and I'm just thinking about like how these conversations are being shared presently, and in our world of like TikTok and like Instagram and really quick fire analyses of this term, which, you know, I feel like I've seen a ton of these. But what I liked about the link that Ruben shared, and I'm going to try to find it, is that it's like an actual sit down conversation with a bunch of folks that have a discussion about it. And so, you know, while I'm happy that the conversations are happening in these like shorter bursts of information that's disseminating, that's the, you know, I feel like, again, that's like another center point of this conversation. And when you do things, when you do things in the snap, and you don't have a whole process behind the switch or conversations around why terminologies are shifting, you lose all of that context, and then people get left confused, and perhaps I don't know, it becomes a trend rather than something that really is solidified in conversations and in like these contexts of I don't know.
No,
I lost my.
No, I agree 100% that it's important that art historical knowledge and art as representation of a larger cultural narrative is often at the center of these conversations. So it's not reductive to deliberate and to deeply consider what these terms mean. And I think, not to put Ruben on the spot, but I think that this is a large part of that piece that you did about the Hispanic Society in New York, and the shift that's trying to take place around wanting to create a sense of community with the long held, you know, Dominican neighborhood that surrounds it, you know, at this particular juncture, to make those connections. And a lot of the pieces that you referenced in that, thinking about representations of race in their, you know, what are the objects within the collection that are already telling these stories of, you know, of multiracial Afro-Latinidad, of connective tissue that puts together all of these different art historical moments. So going back into the collection and thinking about the objects differently, right? To bring out the stories that were already there, that were already telling a story of Afro-Latinx, if you will.
well, thank you all. Thank you, Ella, Ruben, Lucia, and Bernadette. I think this was a really wonderful conversation. I have some things to think about, and I really want to make some parallels to other fields of art history with terminology and the expectations of it all. So thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you all had a great time, and we will see you later. Have a beautiful evening.